Hey guys, welcome back to How to Roll Dice. I'm Josh, and in today's Daily Dive, just wanted to do a quick little review of how my review scoreboard works. Now that I'm going to be using that as more of a majority or a bulk of my actual review videos, it's basically going to be on the side all of the time throughout the course of the video, short of, a quick introduction. I wanted to break down exactly what it is and how I use it, because for newer people, it might seem like a really weird system, but I assure you I have put a good deal of thought into it, and I've found that it works really well for reviewing almost anything, but obviously in this case, particularly board games or tabletop games in general. So it's a 5 category system. At the top, you've got theme and immersion. Obviously, that's talking about the amount of theme that the game presents to you as the player or to your group of players, and how immersive the game feels throughout the game. So do you actually feel like you're doing what the game is supposed to represent? Do you feel like colonists sailing across the sea attempting to, establish settlements in a new world? Do you feel like soldiers on a battlefield fighting against an alien force? Do you feel like ancient Celts struggling to control various territories on an Irish island, off the coast of England? Is that sort of like what's properly being represented in the game through the gameplay? Do you really feel like that's what's going on? Or do you feel like you're just moving wooden pieces or plastic pieces around on a board in order to collect victory points to win a game? Are you just doing the math and playing sort of the moves that you think are going to win you the very obvious game that you're playing? You're not sort of in the mood, you're not being pulled into it, you don't feel like you're actually being, a representative of the story that's supposed to be told here. That's the theme and immersion category. Now, all of my categories, as a quick aside, are going to be getting a score between 0 and 2, meaning 0, 1, or 2. I think only once or twice have I ever used decimals, and it was almost sort of tongue-in-cheek to explain that the game is really on the border and I couldn't honestly make a decision. But it's going to be receiving a score of 0, 1, or 2 in each category, so that the maximum score comes out to 10 out of 10. So it's still a 10 out of 10 rating, it's just how I break it down into the 5 categories. Now that 0 to 2 score is meant to essentially represent 3 different mindsets. A 1 being the sort of middle choice is it's fine. It's great. Or it's, it's pretty good. It's not enough for me to say, go out and buy this game purely because of this aspect or because of this component or feature. But it's not low enough for me to say, this ruins the game, right? If that feature alone is enough for me to warn you about buying the game, for me to sort of give you pause and say, this might not be the game for you if you really care about this category, that would be a 0, right? If it's a 1, it's like, take it or leave it. There's nothing amazing about it. There's nothing terrible about it. It's fine. If you got 1s all the way down, you'd end up with a score of 5 out of 10. That's your typical board game. That's your average board game. If you looked at every board game that had ever been made, that's one that's sort of right in the middle, 50-50, take it or leave it type of board game. If you're looking at a 2, that's, again, me saying, based purely on this category, I would recommend you go out and give this game a try. Or if you care most about this category when you're choosing board games, this is absolutely a game for you. That's a 2 in a category. So that's the 0 to 2 scale, and that's per category. Moving on from the first category of theme and immersion to cost versus quality. This is basically, is the game worth what you're going to have to spend on it to get it? And now that sort of has a couple of different things that work into it when I say, is it worth it? Is it entertaining? Is it actually, worth the components that come in the box? Or I should say, are the components in the box, worth the price that's being stuck on the box? Does it have a good amount of replayability? There might be a game that has beautiful components, tons of content. It's an immaculate game. You love playing it, but you can only ever really play it once. Or maybe you pull it off the shelf once or twice a year, and it's $100 or $200 game. Apologize, dry throat. That's not necessarily a good bang for your buck, right? If you're spending all that money and you're really only getting 1 or 2 annual playthroughs of that game, maybe because it's a really large game, or it's a really complicated game to teach, or it's just a really long game and it takes an entire Saturday, like noon to midnight, to get through a game, or you need to have the perfect number of people. Some games require 6, 7, 8, 9 players to really get the most out of the game. That's not a great sort of bang for your buck as far as cost versus quality goes, because you're not going to get a lot of actual play out of that game, which means you're going to get less entertainment out of that game. Now, even if a game is simple, right? Even if a game is a small box game with minimal components, you spent $30 on it, if you could play that game, not only because it's fun, but because it's simple to teach, easy to play, and fast, if you could play that game every week at a game night or every other week just to whip it out to kill some time while you're waiting for players to show up, that game is absolutely worth its money, because you're going to get so much gameplay out of it. And if you're having a good time doing it, then, there you go. You've got this nice little piece of entertainment that you can slot in almost anywhere. So that's how I work out cost versus quality. It's not just what's in the box, but it's how much use you get out of the box, right? And that's a pretty heavy one for me. I weigh that in, that for me personally in my collection, I weigh that quite heavily because it's money, I always recommend you guys not just throw money at games, that you actually do some research and make sure it's a game you're going to enjoy, a game you're going to play. There's games out there that I would love to buy that I'm not going to. One of which, for example, is one that I gave in on and actually bought, and now it's sort of is almost seeming like it was a bad choice, and that's Star Wars Rebellions, because that game seems like I would absolutely love it. But the fact that it's essentially a 1 versus 1 game that requires me to teach the other player a fairly complex system of mechanics, and then it's going to take a very large chunk of a day, probably an entire evening, for just the 2 of us to play. And it's a competitive game, so if one player ends up completely stomping the other player, it might also be a waste of time and the other player might not have any fun. That's way too much effort and risk, right? And that's like a $100 game. Again, it looks amazing, but it's not something that I think I'm ever going to get a lot of play out of, so it might have actually been a bad purchase. I feel the same way about the War of the Rings, which is a War of the Rings 2nd edition, which is a Lord of the Rings game for 2 players that, again, looks amazing, but it's also amazingly complex and somewhat challenging to play and takes a very long time, is only for 2 players. So games like that, I tend to give a lower score because you're just not going to get that sort of bang for your buck, your money's worth out of it. I like board games where you can almost pitch them to a group of friends like, hey, we could go see a movie, the 4 of us, and it's going to be $15 each for tickets, so that's $60, plus some tax, let's call it $65, $70, and then we're each going to grab a soda and maybe a small snack. That's another $10 per person. We're at $100 right there for 1 night of seeing a movie, and that's only going to last 2 hours. Or we could go buy a board game that costs just as much money, get many, many plays out of it. It's even going to last longer if you're spending money on that sort of size of a game. It's probably going to be a 3 or 4 hour game, and we can play it night after night as much as we want, maybe even expand upon it and change it over time. Isn't that a better use of our money? That's how I like to pitch board games. And if you sort of start to stray from the truth of that comparison, then you can't really pitch the game as easily. And that's sort of, again, one of the ways that I pull this this sort of aspect into the argument of how you rate a game. Moving down from there, we have ease of use. Now, this is mainly going to be focused on 2 different things. Is it difficult to actually interact with the various components of the game based off of how they're designed or how they're meant to be used? And is the game overall difficult to use because of its size or because of the way that it's laid out? There are some games that I own, Dead Man's Cabal is one, where after having played the game maybe half a dozen times and actually enjoying the game and thinking it's pretty fun, though I haven't done a proper review on it yet, I've realized that it didn't need to be the size that it is. That board has a lot of dead space in it, a lot of art, a lot of sort of graphical space that doesn't actually have any gameplay component to it, right? It's just because it looks cool, it looks nice, and it does. But is it really worth making the game almost triple the size that it needed to be by spreading it all out on these massive board, templates or tiles with all this art around them, when really it could have probably just fit on a 2 foot by 2 foot board in the center of a table? That probably would have been the right way to go, but they didn't. So is the game unnecessarily large or unnecessarily difficult to work with? Like I mentioned in my Godspeed review, the chevron tokens on the victory point trackers, when you go to stack them, and you do need to stack them because if you're playing a 4 or 5 player game, even a 3 player game, there isn't enough room to fit that many tokens on one space on that board. Once you get past the start space, there isn't enough room to fit more than 1 token. If you have a 4 or 5 player game, you're stacking those tokens vertically, and that's very difficult to do, and there are 4 stacks side by side because there are 4 victory point tracks. So if one tips over, you're going to domino all of them off the board, and that happens multiple times throughout gameplay. That's an obnoxiously designed component. So is a game unnecessarily large, difficult to fit on a table, or is it unnecessarily hard to work with? I used to, and I still do occasionally, bring in the concept of the bump factor. Some games have this, and it can really ruin a game in some cases, and in other cases it doesn't matter. A game like Terraforming Mars is a great example. Each player is given a small, sort of flimsy player board, and you're meant to place cubes in very specific locations on this board to track not only how many resources you currently have, but how many resources you'll be producing at the end of every round. And these need to be tracked very precisely because it's important, and these only move every so often, and they're very difficult to move. So you don't want somebody accidentally increasing their production because they bumped their board and a cube moved over. Now, what's worse is that almost all of these cubes are the same exact color. Some are metallic and some are sort of a gel colored, maybe a green, a purple, what have you. If you bump your board, or if somebody bumps the table and dozens of those cubes go skewing off in some direction, it's very likely that you won't really know where to put them back to. And that could completely ruin the game, because if you put them back in the incorrect place, you've either cheated yourself in the positive direction or cheated yourself in the negative direction. And really nobody else can help you because everybody is so heavily invested on focusing on their own sort of build and engine that they're setting up in the game and their board that they won't know what you were at. It's entirely on you, and if you can't be certain, everything's kind of lost at that point. You can just fudge yourself back to where you think you were, but the game now has to have an asterisk, right? Like if you win that game, that win has to have an asterisk next to it because there's a good chance that you cheated at that point. And if it happens multiple times throughout the game, or if multiple player boards get unsettled because somebody really bangs the table, that's just, it's too easy to screw that whole thing up. So that's ease of use. That's what I factor into that. Moving on from that, we have enjoyable, pretty straightforward. Is it easy to have a good time with this game? Is it unnecessarily challenging? Is it unnecessarily cruel to the losers? Does it require some players to miss a lot of gameplay if they're not doing well? For example, games where if you're not doing well, your turn becomes increasingly and increasingly shorter because you don't have enough to sort of like interact with on the board. Maybe you're playing a conflict heavy game, an American style game, and a lot of your pieces have been removed from the board and you're sort of pigeonholed into a corner. It doesn't matter if the game has a mechanism to prevent you from being entirely wiped off the board, you're not going to be having any fun. And if you're stuck in a situation, or a game has you stuck in a situation based on mechanics where you can't climb back from that edge of defeat that you're on, and you're just sort of stuck moving this one or two pieces around, making no progress and not really being able to impact the rest of the players, you're not having any fun. And if you fall into that state midway through a 2 or 3 hour game, that's terrible. You just want to get up and leave. And no game should make you feel that way. That's not a very easy to enjoy kind of game. Games can be difficult, games can be conflict heavy, but they shouldn't be sort of designed in a way that spiral players down from starting to defeat all the way down to like, what am I even doing here? I have no chance of climbing out of this pit. Some games do that. Monopoly, which is barely a board game, it's really more a sort of logic random engine. That is a game where once you start to lose, the game just makes you lose more and more and more and more and more until you've lost, and then you leave the table. So I keep that in mind when basically going through the enjoyable process. Is it easy to have a good time with it, or is it easy to fall into sort of a snare and get stuck in a crappy position where you're not having any fun, yet you somehow still have to sit out the rest of the game without any real option to improve your situation? And then lastly, is the game teachable? This is probably the easiest category. Is the game sort of rules heavy in a complex way? Sometimes this can matter, or this can factor in whether or not the rulebook is well designed, because obviously if you have a terrible rulebook, it can make any game seem really difficult to learn and play, and it can make a game so complex to understand that you actually have to fumble through 3 or 4 gameplays just to really understand all the rules or rules that you're getting wrong, and then you can correct those to the other players if you're sort of the teacher of the group like I am with mine. But for the most part, if a game is easy to teach, easy to learn, that's going to get a higher score in this category, and for the most part that's going to be the complexity of the game plus the way that the rules are laid out. You can modify the way the rules are laid out. Like if I read a rule book that's laid out poorly, but I fully understand everything, I can rearrange and reiterate the rules in a way that I think is more suited for my player group. So as the teacher, you can sort of correct for that. But if a game is just overly complicated and hard to teach because there's a lot of different strategies or scenarios or options or actions or sort of like really situational triggered rules that are, you know, hard to explain because you really need to understand the greater game before you can understand these minute rules, those games can be difficult to teach without actually jumping into the game and letting players fumble their way through the process. And we actually have a rule in our group based off of the name of one of our friends where if you teach a new game one night, the rule is you must use any additional time that night to play the game again, because you have to give everybody a chance to immediately utilize and sort of solidify what they just learned themselves through the course of playing the game with a second game. If you do it one night and then you push that second playthrough to like 2 weeks away, there's a good chance they're just going to learn it all again, and they're not actually going to solidify any of that knowledge that they just developed for themselves. So that's a little house rule that we have in our group. If there's time, you have to play the new game a second time versus moving on to any other game that night. Yeah, so that's my system. Those are the 5 categories. That's sort of how I break them down, and that's the 0 to 2 system that I use to score them, like I said, for maximum result of 10 out of 10. I hope this video has helped a little bit. If anybody was lost on how I'm rating things here, I think it's fairly straightforward, but I want to make sure you guys have a stronger understanding of what I'm doing when I'm rating things and why I'm rating them the way I do, and maybe you can start to follow along with me and see where I'm coming from here. But other than that, I hope you guys are having a good day. I will see you in tomorrow's video, and if you haven't yet, go down below, subscribe, like, comment, all that stuff, dislike. dislike if you want to, whatever you feel. Unsubscribe, try to hack the channel and delete all my videos, whatever you want to do. Just, take your time, have fun with it. But other than that, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a good one.